Hey folks, I've got another interview with a Draw Steel designer for you guys. In this one, I have a great discussion with senior designer Djordi. Djordi has a decorated past working in video games, and Draw Steel is his first foray into the world of tabletop RPGs. We discuss MCDM's philosophy on classes, level progression, and balance. I got to ask him whether balance is even desirable in games like Draw Steel. I know that's a very controversial subject in the forums that I participate in. Djordi is also the main designer for the Censor and Null classes, among others, so I got to give him some direct feedback on my experiences with the Censor class and ask him about the recent Reddit controversy on why the Null shies away from some of the Eastern martial arts tropes that we've come to expect in D&D style games. Djordi was generous in sharing design insights he's picked up working with legendary creators, and even shared a spoiler on a not yet public high-level ability of the Null. If that stuff interests you, keep listening. As usual, this interview is an audio-only podcast-style experience. If you're only listening, you won't miss anything, so you'll be safe putting this on while you work out or fix the clogged drain in the kitchen. Alright, let's dive in. Alright, I'm joined now by Robert Djordjevich, aka Djordi. Djordi is a highly experienced video game designer, getting his start with Blizzard in the 90s. Familiar titles that he's worked on include Warcraft II, Diablo, Starcraft Broodwar, Uncharted 3, and Guild Wars 2. He was the lead designer on Pandemic Studios' Mercenaries, Playground of Destruction, and design director at Undead Labs working on the State of Decay series. Since May of this year, which is 2024, he's made an exciting transition from video games to tabletop RPGs, where he is a senior designer at MCDM working on their forthcoming flagship system, Draw Steel, which is my newest obsession. So, Djordi, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, we are going to be talking in this interview about Draw Steel, in particular classes. I'm really interested to hear about the class direction for Draw Steel because I've only just kind of got tidbits now. In the last Patreon packet you guys released, you had all of the 9 classes that you are intending to release on the full release of the game. Is that right?
Yeah, we have the base 9 set.
Awesome. Yeah, that's what I thought. But just the first 3 levels. So I'm really excited to hear about, it's tantalizing what you've released. I'm excited to hear about what the plans are for the full 10 level progression. And I also want to get your opinions on some balance questions because that's something that really interests me. But before we get into those topics, I have to just take a personal moment to thank you for being responsible for what was probably one of the most formative books of my childhood, which was actually the game manual for Warcraft II expansion Beyond the Dark Portal. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you, me and my brothers pored over that game manual until it literally fell to pieces. And when I was doing research for this interview and discovered that you were in charge of that project, it was just really cool.
Oh, that's nice. That's super cool. Yeah, that was my baptism by fire in the games industry. I had worked at Kinko's before the games industry, and I had gotten my core skill set of graphic design and layout and what would eventually be turned into user experience design, UI design there. And one of my friends, Bill, he was a producer at Blizzard, and he had done the manual for the original Warcraft I.
Right.
And he had done the voices. This is Bill Roper. And he'd done the voices, and by the time Warcraft II came around, it was just too much work for him, so he needed help, and so I was sort of called in to work on the manual. And that was a great experience. It got me to work directly with the artists, work with Metzen, who was doing a lot of the lore. I made a good impression on the artists because, for simplicity reasons, in the first manual for Warcraft 1, everything was like a flat, black and white, no grayscale, because they just wanted to simplify the printing process.
Right.
But I figured out a way I could clean up with clipping pads, I could do stuff so people could do all their pencil drawings, and so that turned into like a parade of artists coming to my office like, hey, I got a drawing, can you put it in the book? Yeah, I can find a spot for it. Metzen and Samwise and Roman, all those guys. It was super cool.
That is really cool. And the art was really what hooked us. I purchased that game. So, yeah, if I can take everyone back to the summer of 1999. So just to date myself, I was 7 years old at the time. And my cousin invited me to a Tony Hawk Pro Skater competition, little tournament that was being held at the game store at the mall in kind of the nearest big city to us. I won that tournament. Really wasn't that impressive. I'm sure it was just people on their lunch break that worked at the mall. But I did win a $30 gift certificate, which I used to buy a box set, which included Warcraft I, Warcraft II, and the Beyond the Dark Portal expansion. And then I had a little bit of money left over. I bought a pack of Pokemon cards for my cousin so he did not resent me for clobbering him at the tournament. You know, I love the digital era of video games because there's so many convenience things to it. But one of the sad things is that we've lost the experience that I had. I got that box set and we were, long drive home from the city. And of course I want to be playing Warcraft II. I just bought it. You can't in the car. So what do? You pour over that manual. And for some reason, I don't remember the game as much as I remember the experience of just looking through that manual and, imagining I'm Grom Hellscream or Zul'jin. And yeah, it was just awesome.
I mean, that was a very intentional push from the president of Blizzard, Alan Adham, right? He wanted the box to be heavy because the box being heavy indicates value. And, the 90s was that transition where you had 80s video games like the Ultimate series that had cloth maps, and there was a lot of heft to the box. And so Blizzard was like, okay, big manual, big notepad, the disc, whatever. It feels like you were getting value for that. And, slowly that value has been engineered out because those cost of goods, the COG, is it affects the bottom line. And so when companies get bought by big corporations and they want to get infinite growth, well, maybe just a jewel case is enough. Maybe this is enough. Maybe just digital, right? You sort of lose out a bit in that experience. And so that's been one of the pleasant things about shifting into the tabletop industry is you're working on something that even if we do have a digital component, the tangible component's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, then let's talk about that. Let's get into Drawsteel.
Yep.
Like I said, I'm really excited for this game. I've been keeping up with the packets pretty much since probably the advent of the Powerwall when you guys started talking about that. That's when I saw that you guys were doing something really special with this game. But as far as classes go with Drawsteel, like I said before, you're releasing 9 classes for the upcoming full release of the game, and so far a preview of all of those have been included in the playtest packets. They are the Censor, the Conduit, the Elementalist, the Fury, the Null, the Shadow, the Tactician, the Talent, and the Troubadour. Which, by the way, this is a game which is very much in the D&D tradition, and it's kind of built around these keywords of tactical, heroic, cinematic fantasy. If you guys want to hear more about that, I recorded an interview with James Introcaso, who's the lead designer on this project. I will have that linked in the description, and probably there'll be a card in the corner. But in a game in the D&D tradition, why not a fighter? Why a tactician?
Because we have a philosophy, and this came up in our original brainstorms for classes, of no oatmeal. And what no oatmeal means is the fighter is a classic class, right? Very classic, going back, to when it was Fighting Man in the 1970s, early editions, right? And it is sort of over the years turned into the most standard, like, hey, if you want to intro to the game, the fighter is simple, right? And we took a lot of inspiration from tactical games out there, some of the more tactically oriented editions of D&D, like the 4th edition, where the fighter is interesting, right? And so we kind of combined that fighter fantasy with the tactician, warlord fantasy from certain games where you're sort of commanding the team, right? You want a little bit more of connection to the rest of the group. And so we want to give it a bit of character. Character is important. A lot of stuff that Matt is doing is, I use the term Colvillian language, but it's a little bit of that, like, the experience you had with the Warcraft II manual. It isn't just the rules, it is like the fantasy is this role, as it kind of gets you sort of prepped to role play. And so the role playing is coming up in combat by what you're doing, but it's also giving you a hook for out of combat situations. So there's tactician, a tactical mind, a smart frontline warrior. It seems cool.
I'm so glad that you guys are doing that, because this is something I've been talking about, mostly when it comes to video game RPGs, CRPGs, to be more specific, is this kind of tightrope you're walking when you're designing classes in games in the kind of D&D tradition, where, of course, players want to be able to make their characters in your game, right? So if they're transitioning from Dungeons and Dragons, they want to be able to make either transition their Dungeons and Dragons characters directly, port them directly into Draw Steel, or they want to have a smooth transition of imagining a concept in the system that they're familiar with to porting that into Draw Steel. So you do want to be capturing the kind of the archetypes that are just expected in this gaming tradition. But there's also this problem, I feel like, where it seems like the purpose to me of a class system, I like to think of it as the what can I be question, right? Like if you have a new player, they're trying to make a character and they ask you, what can I be? You want to have an answer for that. And if you're making a game that isn't Pathfinder, that isn't Dungeons and Dragons, you want an answer that's unique to your game. And it feels like a lot of games have been shying away from answering that question in a way that's new and unique and interesting, and is maybe inventing new archetypes rather than just copying archetypes from the 70s, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and you're trying to set up players and directors for success, right? And so you're trying to give them a package of what the character is. And, the packages we're creating are there to emphasize, our cinematic and tactical and heroic fantasy pillars. And so the classes we're creating lean into that a little bit more. They're like, if you kind of follow the guidelines of the class, you can get more of that tactical cinematic experience we like. Like to your point, like the D&D classes had something else going on because they sort of emerged from a tactical wargame experience in the 1970s. They were going for something else. And then there have been plenty of other games that have been more broad in how constructible they are, going back to hero system, champions or GURPS, or even, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I think has leaned into this where the feat language is used so strongly, so broadly that you almost construct a point by character.
Right.
Like from hero system from the 80s, right? And so that is a way to get like any fantasy in there. And we want, people to have a broad fantasy to sort of fit, but we're going for something in particular here, right? And so rather than try to serve everyone, it's Oatmeal. Oatmeal is palatable to everyone, but it doesn't have a distinct flavor profile.
Right.
We're picking flavors, and those flavors might be suited more to one style play than another, but that's at least something you can react to, right? If you want to sort of change stuff up, there's at least a flavor profile for you to react to versus this can be anything and you have no context how to start.
Right. Yeah, and if players like the flavor of the classes that you're presenting, I mean, win-win. But if they don't, it's a very easy out, right? They can learn very quickly this isn't the game for them.
Yeah. Or maybe it isn't yet, right? Maybe when we drop another book with more classes that have a little bit more of a distinct character, that's what they were looking for. Like the Acolyte or the Operator, some of the classes we've talked about for the future.
Do you have plans to release more classes in supplement books?
In some form or another, we're going to release more classes, presuming people like Draw Steel.
Right, of course.
If they hate it, it's like, well, like, here you go, more of what you hate, right? Like,
right. Yeah, well, at least one person likes it, and that's me.
Cool.
So you said a class is a kind of, it's a, what's the right word? Like what you do at a museum.
Curated experience?
Yeah, it's like a curated package for the player. Is that, are you talking more of like a tactical role, like what this thing does in combat or in the adventure? Is it a narrative package, or when a player picks a class, are they selecting an arc? Is it both? What were you talking about mostly there?
It's a bit of a blend, right? So let's use the Fury as the example. Fury's a very classic character. It fits the kind of barbarian trope. The big rage warrior. We have 3 subclasses that sort of give you a different vibe. We have the Berserker, who's about force movement and damage to objects and knocking people around. We have the Reaver, who's a little bit more clever, and we use them sort of the cunning kind of Conan intelligence is sort of the fantasy there, who kind of slides characters around and sort of strikes from surprise and, has borderline kind of roguish stuff. And then we have the Stormwight that sort of fulfills the kind of lycanthrope fantasy, turn into a giant raging animal. So that's one angle is like, this is the fantasy, you are the raging warrior. Your role in the battlefield is you're a damage dealer, you're a DPS class, and so you're doing a lot of stuff to do direct damage to knock people around. But again, there's flavor. There's flavor custom to draw steel. There's flavor custom to the world of Orden, to the timescape, to the world that Matt has built and we're all sort of extending. And that is the Fury's connected to this font of anger energy, the primordial chaos. And so as you level up, like you start out as a very traditional like rage trope, but as you sort of level up, you started connecting to like another manifold in the timescape, and like it's sort of like the Speed Force from DC Comics with the Flash, or if you're familiar with the Immortal Hulk, there's sort of this under theme that the Hulk's rage and gamma stuff is that it was not the science experiment was just a sort of a hook to expose him to this interdimensional dark force. And you get to that as a higher level, you're sort of a force for chaos. You're an expression of chaos. And so that's what I mean by curated experiences. You can start with a very broad fantasy, and as you sort of level up, we do a little bit more of a world building. And you can shave the serial numbers off of that to tweak it whatever you want for your setting. But we are giving you a curated version of it so you can kind of react to, okay, this is how I make a cohesive package.
Gotcha. When I assess a new RPG that has a class system, I have a sort of checklist that I go through in my mind. And of course, I like to see classes with distinct tactical roles, right? Where the designers understand tactical games. They don't try to design classes that do everything, but they divvy up the tactical roles among the classes, and then they allow you some kind of selection within that class to maybe do one of 3 roles or something like that. But you can't do it all, and you have to select, so it creates interesting choices.
Yep.
That's something I've already seen from your game, which is excellent. I've played a Shadow and I have played a Censor. I would like more experience with the system, but both times I felt like when I was selecting between abilities, I was choosing a tactical role. And what's cool is I could talk to the other players at my table and say, what role do we need, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you're looking for synergies, right?
Right.
The initiative system we created is very optimized for synergies because you go once, the director goes once. You go once, the director goes once. And so that encourages you to pay attention to combat, but we have a lot of triggers, a lot of abilities that sort of fire off of that, where you can get very cool combinatorial effects, especially based on your role.
And the second thing on the checklist is I would like an archetype, but specifically I want an archetype with a narrative theme, right? So a barbarian in classic D20 or the Fury for you guys is a good example of this, where when you select this class, you kind of know what your character is going to be. They have a kind of internal tension to them, which is utilizing rage, which is powerful, but also dangerous. And there's an immediate narrative hook for your character right there. So Barbarian's great at that. Classes like Paladins or Clerics can be really great at that. But there's other classes like, say, the Rogue or the Fighter, which don't really have a clear, defined narrative theme. Is that something that you guys have in mind whenever you're changing the Fighter to a Tactician? Is it to provide a clear narrative hook?
It's a clear narrative hook, right? The narrative and the mechanics are tied together. There's a resonance between them, is the term I would use. And so we want
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
To work for both for RP situations and both for moving the lead around the table situations, to use a metaphor Matt likes. And so like the best hooks work for both, right? So you know what this character is out of combat, and you know what this character is in combat.
Yeah. There should be a kind of harmony of the narrative theme and then the actual mechanical, tactical game. Yeah, and so then the final thing I look for, and this is where I find a lot of games tend to miss, and it might be an area that's just different from tabletop to video games, but what I look for is that the narrative themes of the class design fit into an overall theme of the game, a theme that the game is exploring. So a really great example of this, to me, is the monk class in the Pillars of Eternity series. So this is a game series which is exploring very philosophical, kind of Nietzschean themes about the death of God and the real world enlightenment, war between faith and reason, the will to power. These are themes of the game. And then they take the classic monk and they change it so it's recognizably a monk, but it's now a monk about the force of will and overcoming suffering. And mechanically how it works is the resource that it uses to use abilities is called wounds, and you get wounds by taking damage, and you channel that suffering that you feel into overpowering your enemy. If it's so perfect in a Nietzschean game. So as an independent class, it would be excellent, but in the harmony of the overall themes of the game, it's even better. And so that's something I haven't heard a lot from you guys. Is there an overall sort of narrative theme that's being explored in Orden and the timescape in Draw Steel?
There's a bit, right? And so I will go to our Null, our monk-like class, right? Mm-hmm. You know, the Null's heroic resources is discipline versus the Fury's like the rage, right? And
Rage,
like, yeah, the order versus chaos is present there, right? So you imagine they're mechanically very similar. They both have, as they sort of build up their heroic resource, there's a little bit of a chart, and there's these abilities that unlock. And you sort of, you can dump the resource into heroic powers, and then the chart sort of goes down. And so as the Fury gets more rage, they become more this order of chaos and anger, and they should do damage in the battlefield. As the Null gets more disciplined, they get almost like a Zen focus in their body and their Null field. They sort of change reality and sort of enforce more rules. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very classic, even though it's not as pervasive in the game, at least for these two classes, you get a little bit of a glimpse of the broader timescape, order versus chaos, classic conflict that you see in 1970s fantasy that D&D sort of hooked up on. And so some of that stuff exists. There's lore stuff, right? The implication for the Tactician is they went to war colleges, and this sort of, kind of picks your subclass there. The Shadow in particular, the Shadow colleges are, the implied narrative is almost like a Harry Potter house for murder, right? You sort of have a different feel, and you sort of learn something there. And either your character went to one of these colleges, that's where they learned it, or they have a forbidden version of that knowledge, and so it still sort of ties a bit to the world. Mm-hmm. World building is an important part. But again, this is the Oatmeal philosophy. We're doing something specific to give you something to either like or react to make the changes appropriate for your setting.
Right. Yeah, that's really exciting to hear because of course the order versus chaos in the D&D 5e era, I think of that as being a very Colvillian theme, right? He's one of the people that's really popularized it for this new generation of Dungeons and Dragons player. And yeah, now that you mention it, I can see that tension in the design. It's interesting. Like I said, it might be something that doesn't belong in a tabletop game, maybe. And actually, you'd be the perfect person to ask this because, so if you're making Pillars of Eternity, the game experience is a little more in your control than if you're making Draw Steel, which isn't the game, it's the system in which the game is run. And the game belongs to the director. And so maybe they select the themes, and what you want to provide them is kind of a broader selection that they can choose from to make the themes of your games. Is that something you guys have discussed?
Yeah, the thing that makes tabletop different from video games is there is more expression from the director and the players, right? You're creating a lattice work for them to express their own settings and do stuff there. And so it's a balance between us giving people enough of that curated experience to understand what the game is about and what it could be, and giving them enough room to sort of create their own. Another example I'll give you is, we've talked about, we're doing some early work for the Vasaloria campaign setting, whether or not that turns to a whole box set or not, can vary. And we talked about what could that box look like. And one thing we proposed is maybe there's a large map, a hex map, and half the hexes are defined by us. And then the box that provides the rule set for how to fill out the other hexes. And we have some example hexes sort of going there, right? Because we want you to be able to build your own experience. And so whether or not that actually goes in the box set is a little orthogonal to the philosophy is we want to give you enough context to be able to just run stuff, but then to inspire to build your own kind of setting, campaign, theme. You're curating experience for your players. Mm-hmm. Your players are going to have a different vibe, right? You could have all super RP people, you can have very tactical people, some sort of balance. Different people are going to need different things. And so you need to read your players when you sort of build something there. And so there's a lot more self-expression versus a computer game where you have to engineer the experience for everyone.
Right.
One of my friends who I worked at the arena, Jeff Grubb, who goes way back in old school D&D, he's an old school guy. You know, the example he uses is in a tabletop RPG, you go, oh, and you walk through the forest, you see a bunny rabbit, you know, hanging out by the trees. You have expended that much cognitive energy. You sort of came up with the idea. People understand what a bunny rabbit is. In a video game, someone has to model the bunny rabbit. Someone has to skin the bunny rabbit so it can be animated. It has to be animated. It has to have AI. It has to have abilities. It has to have UI icons. There's a huge threshold of work because the game has to fill in the gaps for imagination that you otherwise are doing as a player and a director.
It's cool that you brought up the Vaslorian box set. Yeah, I'm understanding what you're saying a bit more. Maybe it's because it seems like Vasloria should have a theme which is complementary to Draw Steel, but not identical to it, right? And the capital should have narrative themes which aren't identical with Draw Steel. So maybe what you want is a nimbler game, and then you can narrow in specific themes by releasing box sets, and then even narrower by the actual game run at the table and conceived by the director.
Yeah, you know, one way to think about it is the basic Draw Steel books will be the broadest version of the IP.
Right.
And then as you dive into a box set or an adventure, you can get more specific because that specificity is useful for what you're talking about. You know, versus the broad game needs a balance, right? You know, the no oatmeal is important, but we don't want to use my food metaphors. You don't want to go right to sushi like sea urchin, which is a very, very acquired taste. You know, if everything is that intense flavor, then people don't have a chance to learn to enjoy the palate and see what they like. Right. So you go a little bit broader in the lore, even though you're specific in the books. And then when you go to box sets and adventures, you have an opportunity to get really deep and fiddly about stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I know you can't answer this question, but it's just something I'm curious about. So I'll ask it as open-ended for the audience. But yeah, I wonder if classes need to fit the narrative themes, and then the narrative themes are narrowed in from Draw Steel broadly to setting box sets to the actual game. I wonder if setting box sets ought to provide maybe different subclass options that would narrow in specifically.
You know, subclasses or classes that seem appropriate to the kind of, for lack of a better term, the vibe, the theme you're going for.
All right. Well, let's talk about scaling and level progression, because I just recently played the Patreon test packet that you guys released last month, just a few weeks ago. And so far, though, I've only been able to play level 1 characters. So the ideas of scaling is all, it's just kind of exciting and promising to me. I guess my first question is, what percentage of progression comes from class, and what percentage is rewards that you get from your actual adventures?
Yeah, so that is an important philosophical question for us, because some of the very like mechanistic systems we took inspiration from kind of want to define all the rules of progression. You get a feat here, you get a perk here, you get like a talent point here, to keep stuff very balanced, because they want your characters to be very portable to play at any table.
Right.
And we'll probably have guidelines for that, like, hey, like this is expected progression for what's going on. But it's super important, again, for that creative experience, that creative co-experience between the directors and players, for the players to feel like they can kind of go out in the world and find stuff that's going to change them. And so that's when we talk about things like titles and treasures. Like, there's no necessary cap. You know, there could be a limited amount of items you're sort of attuned to, for lack of a better term. But like titles, as long as you sort of fulfill the criteria, you know, the director can maybe slow the pace you get them, but it's presumed you're going to get as many titles based on your actions as possible. Like, we're not capping that stuff there. And so while there is a lattice work or scaffolding, you know, I like those metaphors, that has sort of core progression that we understand like the ornamentation, other things there can change that up to make your campaign feel cool, feel like unique, feel like you had an impact.
So titles are a little bit like feats, if you're familiar with, you know, sort of other D20 systems.
Yep.
Except they're not gained by leveling up, right?
Correct. there we have some titles with guidelines like, oh, this you probably shouldn't give this out to a higher echelon, like level 4 to 7, echelon 2.
Right.
But I'll give you an example. We've been doing a play test, and we unlocked the criteria for capturing by being captain of a boat. And that title, there's like 3 options for those abilities, and so different people picked different options that sort of suited their sort of play style.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really cool. You mentioned echelon. What's an echelon exactly?
That is a term we're using right now for kind of levels of play, and so we're experimenting with language to avoid the classic D&D problem, which was the level of your character and the level of your dungeon and the level of the monster and the level of your spell.
Right.
We're all in different scales, even though they're the same term. And so echelon for us is the hierarchy of play, right? So levels 1 to 3 is echelon 1, 4 to 6 echelon 2, 7 to 9 is echelon 3, and then level 10 is echelon 4. Those terms might change. We play around with language to sort of get just the right vibe, but that's the goal, is sort of kind of give you that hierarchy of play.
Awesome. So now I'm really curious. What would be the difference between echelon 2 and echelon 1? Let's say qualitatively, besides just you've gained more levels. Is there a qualitative difference, or is it just kind of an arbitrary line that you've drawn?
I think the game will hit its kind of core complexity, and perhaps when you talk to Willie about monsters, you can go into more of it. Is there's a balance between giving a lot of tactical options at levels 1 to 3, the first echelon, and 4 to 6 you start having a robust set of abilities, and after that you add abilities, but you sort of have kind of your core engine. We think at that sort of that second echelon, that sort of 4 to 6. That's when the heart of a class sort of exists.
Gotcha. So what's progression like for 3 to 4 echelons then, if you're not adding abilities?
Well, you're adding some abilities, right? But you always have more powers that require more heroic resource, and you have some stuff that sort of starts to change the rules, right? And higher level abilities can do more interesting stuff. So I'll give you all a minor spoiler.
Awesome.
This is an ability I like for if you are level 9 Null who is the Metakinetic subclass. There's an ability we currently are calling Unravel, and that's an attack. You sort of punch someone, with your Null power. You sort of disrupt their connection to the manifold they're on, and they're dazed until save ends. And while they're dazed, they take a little bit of damage at the beginning of the turn. It's standard classic. But if that damage reduces them to 0 stamina, they not only die, they're forgotten forever by the timescape.
Wow.
It's just flavor, right? But it's flavor that feels impactful.
Right.
And so that's what we're sort of going for, is like, are you level 10, that's levels 9 and 10, the higher echelons 3 and 4 level, you're like a world-changing hero. So can we come up with abilities there that have a mechanical impact and give you a little bit of a narrative hook?
There's something similar to the echelon system I remember in the 4E days, where they had a 30-level progression. Yep. And the first 10, they called, what was it, the heroic tier?
It's heroic, paragon, and epic.
Thank you. Yeah. And I guess if I'm remembering right, I mean, I actually was running a 4E campaign not that long ago, but I only really ran in the first 10 levels.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm remembering right, there was a kind of implied ramping up in the stakes, where early on you're saving a town, and then maybe in the next tier you're saving the world. Is there something similar going on with echelons for you guys?
Yeah, we've talked about, for example, at which echelon should you be able to teleport anywhere on the planet you've been, right? Which echelon is it easy to go their manifolds? Which echelon is it easy to resurrect people?
That's a good way to do it. I see.
Right, yeah. And so we have sort of a compressed version of that. It's important to us, to let players play low level as long as they want, but make it easy to get to higher levels. It's not like, we're not building a games as a service where we need people to be monetized for 6 years until they get to level 10. No, if you play a lot, you should be able to get up there. It should provide you good challenges. And so we want to take that kind of 30 level progression, that epic progression you had in 4E, and make it about 1 to 10. And then make level 10, the fourth echelon, kind of open-ended. Like you're going to gather a lot of titles and treasures, and so we'll probably start with a handful of kind of bigger threats, but that'll eventually be okay. What happens post 10? Do we add levels, or do we just sort of have like a more, to use an MMO term, like more of a raid system, where it's sort of like raid gear you sort of build up to sort of make it a little bit more flexible for the director to run?
Yeah, well, I mean, that raises a question I have written down my notes. What's your approach to solving that problem that I mentioned, right? That, okay, here I'm playing 4E, it's a 30 level system. I'm never touching level 11 and up, right? I'm running a campaign from levels 1 to 10. I mean, part of that is that 30 levels is just a lot of content, and,
Yeah.
in our adult lives, we just can't meet that often, right? But I mean, also, I don't think me or any one of our players really want to commit to playing one character that long, because it never feels like the game changes enough, right? That it's always something new each level. So eventually you feel like, I have fought with this fighter enough that I feel like I've mastered the fighter. I've done all the things I want a fighter to do, and it's time to make a new character. Have you guys thought about that problem?
I mean, I don't know if it's a problem or an opportunity, right? Like, I love alts. I love I'm a little bored with this character for now. I'm gonna put them on the shelf. They still exist in the world, right? They're maybe off in a stronghold or off on a little quest, and I pick another character, right? I think that is players playing with the toys. Now, like if you were diving very specifically into a campaign, that's where I think a lot of the titles we talked about works, right? So there's stuff beyond, like, the core class progression. You can sort of try to engineer a situation. I was like, let me set up this situation so I can try to get a title, and that title might unlock an interesting progression beat, something that makes my character feel more unique and cool.
All right, well then let's move on to balance then, because
Sure.
This is a question that fascinates me. I've seen online I've seen it in the last 3 years, but maybe existed before then, I don't know. But it's a kind of attitude that is suspicious of the need for balance in an RPG. Are you familiar with that kind of thinking?
I've heard some stuff on that.
Yeah, so I'm very active on a lot of forums and stuff like that, and where people discuss games, tabletop RPGs, video game RPGs, and across the board, you'll see this very common sentiment where someone will feel like a move that a designer did to balance a certain ability or power, spell, etc., class, that move made the class less cool. And then they feel like, we're balancing this game, which makes things less cool, and the lack of balance was never really a problem, because it's not the language that you hear is that this isn't a PvP game, right? In a PvP game, if something's unbalanced, it's kind of zero sum. The more one person has fun, the less fun it is for the other person. But in a cooperative game, who cares, right? So this is an attitude I have to admit I don't like. I don't want to bias your answer here. I don't like it. Well, I guess I'll start by asking, how do you feel about that? Is there something to that reasoning?
So the way I look at it is there's two aspects. Is one, a metaphor we use at MCDM is people sometimes react poorly when you move their cheese. And that is like, you can apply that to be cheesing the system, but I think it's more just they like their cheese in a certain place. They like their reward in a certain place. And when you move the reward around, there's like kind of a reaction, right? Because it's sort of optimized around this sort of stuff there. So sometimes when you're balancing, you're changing the way stuff is, your status quo, and people react, I like the status quo. So like that's like one thing to consider. As far as balance in general, I think the way I think about it is in a PvE game, like we were building, it is more about there being trust in the system to allow the choices to be interesting, and to avoid a dynamic like 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons had this, where the dynamic was systems mastery, where they give you a bunch of classes, they give you a bunch of feats, you can build whatever, but some of those feats were intentionally kind of bad, right?
Yeah,
like they were not intended, right? And like if you made smart choices, you felt rewarded because I progressed a certain way, I made certain choices in my feats and my classes, and my character is more powerful. And so that aspect of system mastery being important kind of touches on the balance, right? Because some things are intentionally unbalanced. And so I think to your point is like, on one level, yeah, you want to let people build whatever. What's the harm? The harm is if people start to distrust the system to let their fantasy work. It's like, well, I should just build a Fury like my buddy did, because a Fury is tearing up everyone, and I'm doing nowhere near as much damage, because even though I'm a Shadow, it's supposed to be a damage class. Whereas there should be a method for you to be able to get that fantasy.
Interesting.
I'm gonna give you an inside baseball old balance tidbit from StarCraft, from the original. This is James Finney, the lead designer original StarCraft, told me. For people who are not familiar with StarCraft and Warcraft as RTSs, there's different factions on each side, right? And StarCraft was very famous for being one of the earliest games to have a very divergent faction set. The Terrans, the Protoss, and the Zerg.
That was so cool when it dropped. I remember loving that.
Yeah, and there's been a lot written about, wow, that's a difficult balance challenge. Mm-hmm. Now, Warcraft II, orcs versus humans, Beyond the Dark Portal, there was a mirror unit. They were very much the same, and and the only difference is usually an occasional ability you use, like a minor difference. Mm-hmm. It's more challenging to balance two things that are almost the same than three things that are very different. Right? On a big meta level, it's more complicated, but it's harder to compare, like Terran Space Marine to a Protoss Zealot, right? Because they have different costs, they have different scales. Like one is maybe 2, one is maybe 3, right? Versus if you had like two split factions, it was different. The other person to reinforce the idea to me is like Alan Atham, the president of Blizzard, who chef's kiss, that dude is awesome, right? That the amount of boot camp I learned about game design from him, even me is just, I'm the dude who worked in the manual and I contributed to a bunch of stuff here, versus all the important people in the studio. He too take his time to explain everything. And I remember Westworld at the time had put out Red Alert. And Red Alert, you could have, the Allies versus the Soviets, and like you could play factions where you could be the Ukrainians or the Russians in the Soviet system, and they had like minor differences. And he explained to me, that seems cool, but then he talked about the Warcraft II problem, right, where people get focused on these little differences here that don't make a big deal. But then people are like, well, obviously you should always take the Russians because that thing is always going to be slightly better. And so the more you can build the mechanical engine to be different while kind of delivering on the fantasy, the better it is for balance. Because then people aren't like, well, I should always go for this because it's always going to do 1 point more, 2 point more damage.
Yeah, wow. What you're saying is, I hadn't thought about it before, and this is something I've thought a lot about, but I mean, you're exactly right. If I'm remembering back to my Warcraft 2 days, if I was deciding, okay, am I going to play orcs, am I going to play humans? Oh, then I ask, well, do I want the Ogre Mage's spells or do I want the Paladin spells, right?
Yep.
And if I felt that the Ogre Mage's spells were better, then I'm going to want to pick orcs every time because it's really just that comparison. Yep. Where it is an interesting choice between Terran and Zerg and Protoss, right? I mean, StarCraft, Broodwar, what a legendary game for these factions, right? I mean, still, however many years later, the high level of play that you get from this kind of triangle faction system is incredible. And yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the idea of interesting choices, because that is, besides my initial reaction when I hear people kind of slandering balance, my initial reaction is anger. When I really try to understand what they're saying, what I've noticed is a kind of difference in language where people, let's say on my side of the fence, that are really interested in balance and design, what we talk about is interesting choices. Yeah. And the folks that are suspicious of balance, what they talk about is doing cool stuff, right? You might even say in Colvillian language, doing dope shit.
Yep.
And Draw Steel is something where both of those have been a big part of the design goals of the game. So how are you guys balancing them, I guess? Or how are you squaring that circle?
I mean, like it comes down to making sure the class has a core engine that works regardless. There's we got a lot of props, and this was before my time, but on Flea Mortals, where you run the monsters of Flea Mortals, and you feel like a tactical genius because the guideline's right there. If you just follow the instructions there, you get to do cool stuff.
Right.
And so at a base level, just follow the instructions of your abilities. They should work combinatorially in a cool way. And there should be opportunities for you to go, okay, now I'm making an interesting choice about when to do this. Oh, now it's someone else's turn. I have a trigger to start to react, right? So we're creating a little tendrils for the party to work together, but you're just trying to optimize for your core engine. This is it's classic like flow state in video games, right? Is you have a set of friction that sort of pushes on you and you feel weak, and then you kind of overcome the friction, you feel powerful for a little bit, and you get to express that power until it's friction, right? So we want you to be able to do cool stuff, but we want to put hurdles in the way. So when you clear the hurdle, that cool stuff feels even better because you kind of clear a hurdle to make it happen.
Right. Okay. So there's kind of part of what makes the cool stuff cool is the resistance.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. This is like you get in a power gamer philosophy. I'm a little bit of a power gamer. I'm gonna self-admit, right? I love power, right? But my power game philosophy is a bit of nuance in that I want to build characters good at something, right? And they're not going to be good at everything. They're going to be good at something. And so part of the game is, can I engineer situations where it naturally makes sense for my character being good at something to kind of triumph?
Right.
That's different than the power gamer who's like engineered, like I found a rules hack to make me good at everything. So like, the situation would be like if you're playing like Legend of the Five Rings, like the Japanese Bushido pastiche game, you might make someone who's a very good duelist, but maybe not that good at other combat, right? And so you engineer situations where that guy maybe insults someone to get someone in a duel to make a fight happen, right? That's like a role playing and a mechanical kind of alignment there to make you interesting. We
touched a little bit on that, if I'm understanding you right. James and I did in our last interview. It's a tension I see particularly in RPG video games is, I think of it as a tension between tactics and strategy, but you could say it's the difference between combat choices and build choices. Yeah. Where if your build choices are too impactful, combat actually becomes quite boring because you get what I call the 5e fighter design, where you can make a build which is so hyper efficient at taking one action that you're not making choices in combat anymore. You're always just choosing that action. It's the key for every lock. And for the fighter, that's the attack action. And I do see people, when you branch away from that, there is a kind of gamer which says, well, now I'm not able to do my cool stuff, which is make someone hyper efficient at doing one thing. I think it's a strength of your guys' game that it's genuinely tactical in the sense that the choices that you make in combat are the juice. It's a really important part of the game. And because that's so fun, as what I'm hoping, like I said, I haven't played actually past level 1, but just from looking at so far even levels 3, because choices in combat are so fun, then your build choices become interesting, not because you're making one thing hyper efficient, but you're trying to collect a lot of tools, and you're trying to synergize a lot of those tools with your teammates. Yeah, you are, a lot of core game design is you're building an engine, and then something throws a monkey wrench in that engine. You have to react to that monkey wrench to get your engine sort of going. And sometimes you start with a monkey wrench, you're trying to get rid of it, right? And that's the back and forth of good game design, in my opinion. Awesome. Well, yeah, I think it's really cool to see, to hear you talk about insights that you've gotten from, legendary games like Warcraft and Starcraft, Broodwar, bringing those into tabletop. It's, really exciting. All right, well, let's talk about the Censor then. I just played a playtest with the brand new Censor class, which my understanding is that, of course, everyone at the Draw Steel design team pitches in, but am I correct in understanding that the Censor is kind of your project? Yeah, it's been mostly my project. There was a very early playtest Censor like last year, which was just kind of a one-pager with a couple example abilities, and so that was sort of the only reference I had beyond kind of building this one from scratch. Gotcha. So maybe the Null is the most built from scratch class. There was already a version of the Tactician and Fury that I revised, and so everyone touched on stuff, but Censor and Null probably had the most impact so far. Awesome. Yeah, I played a level 1 Censor in 2 hard combats. It was run by a fellow Drawsteel YouTuber, the Dice Society. He was running a recorded game of a lot of the content creators kind of in the Draw Steel space. And I believe by the time this video releases, I'm sure he will have released that playtest. So if you guys want to see it, I have it linked in the description. But nice. Yeah, I thought the Censor was extremely, extremely cool. I studied medieval history, actually. That's what my master's was in. And I've always loved this kind of something that actually didn't exist in history so much, but the image of the knight, the holy warrior. Yeah. The Censor, to me, is exploring this really fun avenue of that archetype, which is there's kind of an edge to it, I felt like, in the way you've designed it, where I mean, clearly it's the holy warrior, but you get kind of the dark side of that moral absolutism. At least I could read that through some of the names that you've picked.
Yeah, that was very intentional. And like, I know some people might be turned off by that, but again, going back to our no oatmeal philosophy, is we are giving you a context, right? The context that, these are holy warriors, they're out for good, right? But maybe their vision of good isn't 100% aligned to yours, right? And so that makes interesting questions for role-playing. They are a cop, for all the baggage being a cop in modern society is, and like, now they're a cop in a fantasy situation where you're all heroes, right? So they're an idealized version of that. But even an idealized cop, like, look at the reality situation, there are tough challenges, for someone, who is acting as a protector, or if you want to be more critical, like a force for violence for order in society.
Yeah, it made me maybe Draw Steel isn't the game for this, but just doing the one playtest of the Censor, and especially remembering, I think it's Matt Colville who makes kind of paladins or censors in his world the kind of de facto judges. Okay, good. That is him.
That is an aspect of like the judgment, the sort of like that kind of paladin archetype is sort of Matt's favorite in a way, right? So it's very important for it to represent a particular message. And I don't mean particular like a particular like agenda message. It's just it has to be specific, it has to be interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean those things together, like your design and remembering Matt's sort of narrative design. It reminded me of an overlooked gem in the CRPG world, which is Obsidian's Tyranny game, where you'd play a Fate Binder, and Fate Binders are judges, but they're judges of a explicitly evil overlord who has conquered the world. And the game was so fun, they would throw scenarios at you where, you are the law and you're going to make a judgment. And and the choices weren't easy to make. And I want to do that now with your Censor, just from reading the design you've made so far. So very evocative.
Nice, thank you.
And you also had edicts. When I was looking ahead, I didn't get to use any of these, but the level 3 abilities that you can pick, which are 7 cost heroic abilities, were all edicts that you made on the battlefield, which is extremely cool to me.
Yeah, like they're mechanically just an aura, but you want the flavor. And again, the flavor's part of the package. The sizzle and the steak are both important.
Yeah.
And so using the metaphor of edict, it feels like you were imposing the will of your god on reality. That felt like very core to the class.
You're the judge, and you're writing the laws of this combat. My instinct would have been to have made edicts a conduit, which is kind of like the cleric class feature. But yeah, seeing you put it on the Censor, I realized that's the better move, because this is the class that you're picking to represent the enforcement of law. So of course they're the one that writes edicts for the battlefield.
Yeah, like if you have an edict, if you have a Censor and a conduit in the party, it's kind of like bad cop, good cop, right? There's a little bit of like, one's more forceful, one is more like, supportive. And, our conduit is a little bit more of the priest than the battle priest, right? He's more of the traditional priest in cloth. And there are options you can get for the conduit to give them a little bit more oomph, but we're trying to make them a little bit more specific, right? Like, okay, if you want the holy warrior in armor, the Censor is more likely to be the thing that you get for that versus the conduit.
So in the specifics of the playtest, of course I didn't get to test all the abilities, but the ones I took I thought performed pretty well. I think Banking Judgment was immediately excellent, When I was banking 2 judgment on enemies, it felt really good. Although I will say, as I banked higher, I never got any use out of banking 4 judgment, just because of this new potency kind of check that you guys have just introduced in the game. And you know, the version I'm testing might be pretty far behind what you guys are actually working on right now, but the presence weak potency gate, maybe it was just the encounter that the Dice Society designed, but it never triggered on anyone. And I did get this feeling, and it was actually the same for the Purifying Fire 5 cost ability, which a lot of the value of this ability was in a potency check, where because it felt like these abilities are designed to be used on the big unit, you know, the boss, the solo, the captain, and those are also the units that tended to have higher characteristics, so that I could never get those potency effects to stick. Do you know what I mean? Have you guys noticed that problem in playtesting, or is that just me?
I mean, it's something that comes up, right? So, you know, to think tactically, you have a spread of abilities, and some of them affect different stats, right? So what makes intuitive sense? The banking judgment for the Censor, people who have weak will, weak presence, right? That's what makes sense, you know, to sort of go for that, right? If you bank judgment on, like, you know, the charismatic overlord, he's going to be like, no, what? You know, it's a very classic using comic books. You know, you have like the purple man who can mind control everyone, except for all the strong-willed guys, you know, like Kingpin and Daredevil and Dr.
Why is he
Doom.
always purple?
Right? They always slough it off like, you're here just to show how cool I am, right? That's a little bit of us, right? And so, you know, when I built Tacticians with similar issues, like there's, if we're fighting like, you know, we're fighting the Chimera. Yeah, we can out-reason that Chimera great. You know, the marks are awesome. Oh no, we fighting the Wizard. Well, those marks aren't doing much. Maybe you need to go for, you know, concussive attacks to go for might. And so that's something to think about for your engine, the disruption, is what are the stats of your enemies? And there are abilities, and they're a little bit rare right now, that can affect the potency of attacks.
Okay,
right? So,
great. That's what I was going to ask next. Yeah, because I don't have a familiarity with your system to know whether that's a thing. But while I was playing it, I felt like, man, if there was a way I could boost my potency that wasn't just, you know, M strong on a tier 3 roll, then this would feel really, really good.
And so we're being very careful with the things that sort of tweak your potency, right? Because we want the potency to matter. But they exist. Like, for example, the Tactician Insurgent subclass has a triggered ability that can add surges, but if you spend some extra focus, you can increase or decrease the potency of an attack.
Okay. Well, awesome. That's great to hear. The 3 cost ability I took on my Censor was Driving Assault, which was awesome. Every time I used it, it was cool. It was very cinematic in that it was easy to visualize. It felt like I was playing through a movie fight scene when I used that ability. And we also had this incredible combo. Goblin Points, a fellow YouTuber who was playing in this playtest with us, he was running a talent, and the 5 cost ability he took as the talent was, I think it's called Inertia Field. What it did was, when I moved, there was like a force field that would push enemies away from me. And for people familiar with the Drawsteel system, if you push targets into terrain or into other enemies, they take damage. And so Inertia Field felt like I had a conversion formula for turning my movement into damage. And then I had this Driving Assault ability, which gave me more movement, and I was flying all over the battlefield, just pushing everyone around into walls. I was killing minions on my movement without even using my action, and it felt so cool. It was fun to see the synergy at the table, and to me, it's stuff like that that's really going to make Drawsteel stand out. So I guess there's not a question except to say just well done. That was awesome.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the tactical stuff. Like, and the engine is like, another metaphor with the engine is like, what are the USB ports in and out that other classes and other abilities can interact with to make you feel cool for being clever?
Yeah, well, we did feel cool. All right, well, just to end off then, we could talk a little bit about the Null. There was a very popular post on Reddit about the Null, and some people were feeling some disappointment. They felt like the Null class didn't scratch that itch of, let's say, the classic D20 fantasy monk that people have come to expect. Now, personally, I did not have that feeling. I felt like there was a lot of the signatures that felt very martial arts to me.
Yeah.
And what was different, the null part of the class is just pretty standard for what we've been discussing here, which is you guys, the no oatmeal philosophy, you wanted to add something. But I wonder, and it's fine if you have no comment about this, but I'm wondering what your thoughts on that controversy are. How did you react to it? Or did you notice it at all?
I noticed it. Okay. I saw it. The inception for the null was psionic warrior of order, had that their body is the ultimate expression of their weapon, right? And that led to a no kits, that led to the null field, right, and that led to a quasi martial arts vibe. But to your point, the monk already exists, right? Why should we build our monk has smoked paprika instead of paprika, right? Like we want to build something more unique to the timescape, to the manifold, to our sense of order, right? And so that is like one thing we built, right? And so this is also a little bit of our vibe with like tactical cinematic heroic fantasy, a little bit comic booky, right? And so the martial arts we're talking about is very, very comic booky. And there's thing we want to tread carefully on, right? Like there would be a version of the null would be very Eastern martial arts inspired, right? I don't have expertise in kempo karate versus open hand. Like beyond as a kid, watching like 80s action movies, and a little bit of like to quote a term used, it can be a little gross. This sort of Asiaphilia or Asia like this. They're like a culture becomes a prop, right? Right. And so like we want kind of the action movie martial arts, which is not going deep into that philosophical stuff, and we want a little bit more of like the philosophy that's representative of our setting, right? Which is the sense of order, the sense of timescape, the sense of psionics, being an expression through the body.
Yeah. So I haven't had a chance to play the null, but just reading over it, I felt it was very cool and evocative. So yeah, I guess I don't fully understand the criticism, but yeah, hearing you say that there is a kind of deliberate distancing from the D20 fantasy monk stereotypes. Like I said to you earlier, I studied medieval history, and there's definitely a sense where the D&D tradition of fantasy games started with medieval enthusiasts making some level of medieval simulationism, but the archetypes in their games became a separate thing, right? And some of that drew from literature, which is more or less connected or disconnected from real history, right? Like the image of the knight. I think Scott, I can't remember his full name, but the author of Ivanhoe, Scott, he wrote in early papers on the Middle Ages that the popular image of a knight was like a kind of frostwork, right? Destined to melt from the rays of truth. In short, it's not real. Knights weren't like this. The same way the samurai, let's say, of our fiction isn't really that much like the samurai of real history. So I do think there's some leeway there, but this is the accepted standard, at least in academia, which is if you're going to dabble in cultures which aren't your own culture, there's an extra standard of respect. You have to do a lot of research. And in the world of tabletop RPGs, where design teams are 3 to 5 people, you cannot expect a design team to have the expertise to do all of the cultures that you want in our fantasy respectfully. So yeah, it seems to me to be a perfectly good reason to shy away from a martial artist.
There would be a version of this where we would hire a sensitivity reader and do some research with professional martial artists from different disciplines, but then you can then create a more authentic martial arts experience for the game that may be not what the game needs, and then you're investing a lot of resources into something that has diminishing returns.
Yeah,
and so if your game is about that, I totally makes sense, right? There was I forget the name of it. There was an interesting like video game that was sort of I think Sifu, right? With this game that was about kind of like almost like a corridor crawler, martial arts game where your character kind of got older over time. It was super interesting. But a critique they got, if I remember correctly, no one on the team was of Chinese or Japanese or any ancestry that had a tie culturally to martial arts, or had really studied it. Like wasn't like they were like, like hobbyists and who had belts and things like that. They're just, it's cool in the movies. And they sort of went kind of beyond like the martial arts stuff and sort of did a take on the culture, which you're not going to be authentic, right? So that's a critique they got, and whether or not the game is fun, that's something you have to sort of think about, is like there's two layers to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will say to people who find this kind of reasoning frustrating that it's dabbling in cultures which aren't your own. The obstacle to this isn't. It's a very natural obstacle of language a lot of the time, right? So like I studied philosophy. I'm very passionate about Confucian philosophy. I love it. It would be very difficult for me to publish a paper on Confucian philosophy because I just don't speak Mandarin. And reading and translation can get you so far, but it's not going to get you far enough to reach the high professional standard of publishing. We could say games aren't that serious, but maybe they should be. I think I don't think it's an unreasonable standard. Yeah.
One of my favorite video game series is Civilization, and they've been doing a lot of work, in the latest one with the Shawnee and for Tecumseh to find, tribal representatives to sort of do an authentic version of that. Now, does every person from that tribe, agree with what they're doing? Probably not, right? But they sort of went through and sort of picked an angle. A thing that we've heard a lot in video games, and I think this translates to tabletop games, is representation is good, not even for simple like, hey, it is a moral good to be more representative. Like that's one angle to it. It is better for your product because you tell more authentic stories, and people respond to authentic stories even if it isn't from their background. Like people can sniff test. They can sniff test authenticity, right?
Absolutely.
So like,
you can tell.
If you did the authentic work for something that isn't there, like you can watch that. Oh, like this story feels true. Like when I watch Reservation Dogs, this story feels true because the people with that background wrote a true story that was distinct. And I can then project about my distinct stories that are different, and this feels like more real. That's like just a net good. Even besides a moral philosophy, it's good for the product.
It's aesthetically more valuable, right? Like it's just better art that way. Yeah. Just as a last little comment, longtime listeners of my channel might know this about me, but I am, to use Djordi language, I am ancestrally North American, but I am not culturally North American. My family moved actually just after the late 90s. We moved away from North America, and I spent most of my childhood in a place which we called it back then the Third World, but today they call it like the Global South. But I mean, most importantly, it was an animism culture. And my father is an academic, and he wrote his PhD dissertation on the animism of this culture. Animism is something which appears in the fantasy zeitgeist, right? And classes like Druids. Of course, that's a different continent of animism, but I mean, you can tell the difference in the decades of improvement of people who've examined this culture and cultures like this and drawn from them. Yeah. So, I completely agree with you guys. There's so many good reasons to stick with a team that has their areas of expertise and to play off those areas of expertise and realize that you can't do everything, and you can't hit every trope. You can't embody every character someone can imagine. But what instead you can offer them is the cool concepts you have. So far, from the playtest materials, I'm really excited about your classes. I think there's some amazing concepts here. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that.
All right. Well, that is the end of my questions. Is there anything you wanted to talk about?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. Well, Djordi, thank you so much. This has been a very insightful conversation for me. Thanks for taking the time. And I'll just do a shout out to my brother who also loved your Warcraft II manual. Oh, nice. He's gonna be so excited that I spoke to you. Actually, I texted him, and it's funny, in my channel I've done, I've had videos over 1 million views. I've had videos that have been publicly praised by industry greats like Josh Sawyer. I've had great interview guests like James Intercasso, but when I told him I was interviewing you, the guy who did the Warcraft manual, that's when he started paying attention to my channel. Nice. And hopefully he'll be as excited about Draw Steel, this project you're working on now. I think there's so much promise for this game, and really exciting to see someone so experienced in video games going over to tabletop RPGs.
Well, thank you so much.
And that's it for this one, folks. If you want more content like this, check out my interview with Draw Steel's lead designer, James Introcaso. Also subscribe, because I'll be recording more interviews like this. At the very least, James will be coming back on to discuss loot and treasures with me on Friday of this week. My plan is to have it released by next week. Also, check out the playtest I participated in, hosted by the Die Society. There you can watch the newest version of Draw Steel being played. I believe the Die Society got special permission from MCDM to share the rules for abilities we used in the game, which would otherwise only be available for Patreon supporters and contract playtesters. So that's a great way to see what Draw Steel is like without needing to fork over any cash at this point. The video is linked in the description. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.